If you hardly post anything, people start to think that something is wrong with you. Maybe not out loud, maybe not even consciously, but in this world it has already become something like a background suspicion. If you are almost absent from the feed, if you do not show your life, then either nothing is happening to you, or you have fallen out of life, or you are simply a loser who has nothing to present to the world. Today, existence has almost imperceptibly been confused with being seen. As if a moment is not posted, it almost did not exist. As if an experience that nobody reacted to is not entirely real. We live in a strange era. An era in which life is more and more often lived not from the inside, but as if from the side. With a constant inner observer. With the feeling that you are not just living, but at the same time also watching yourself from the outside. How it looks, how it reads, how it can be shown. You can be sitting in a cafe, you can be walking down a beautiful street. You can be laughing with someone close to you. And somewhere in the background there can live this quiet, almost unnoticeable question. Is this worth capturing? How will this look? What will they think? You can convince yourself as much as you want that you do not care. But the very fact that this question arises already changes the very fabric of life. You seem to be living, but part of you is already standing next to the camera. Part of you is no longer inside the moment, but next to it. As if you are both the actor and the operator at the same time. And this happens so quietly that we have almost stopped noticing that it is strange at all. Once, life simply happened. It occurred. It flowed. And it disappeared. Now it is as if it has to leave a trace. A confirmation. Proof that it was there. We live in a world where memory is gradually being replaced by an archive. Where an experience is valued not only for the fact that you lived it, but also for how it looks from the outside. And against this background, a person who hardly publishes anything begins to look strange. Almost suspicious. As if they have refused to take part in a game whose rules nobody ever said out loud, but which everyone somehow accepted. People think about them. They are closed off. They are strange. They probably just have nothing going on. And sometimes, if we are completely honest, they think they probably have just fallen out of life. Because today, silence on social media does not look like silence. It looks like absence, like an empty space. As if you are not visible, you almost do not exist. And there is something deeply disturbing in that. We have become so used to the idea that life has to be shown that we have begun to suspect the life that is not shown. As if reality now needs witnesses. As if it is not quite real if nobody is looking at it. Think about this for a second. When was the last time you did something good, beautiful, or important and did not think even for a moment about how it looks from the outside? Did not think about whether it is worth photographing, recording, saving, posting? Even if you did not do it, the very fact that this thought flashed through your mind already says a lot. We live in a culture where almost every moment passes through an inner filter, public or private. Show or keep it to yourself. And more often it seems that keeping it to yourself is something strange, almost suspicious, almost selfish, as if a life that is not meant for display is some kind of incomplete life. And here appears the figure of a person who hardly posts anything. They seem to fall out of this logic. They exist, but they are not visible. They live, but they do not prove that they live. They do not confirm their existence with regular signals into the general noise. In both cases, there is silence. In both cases, there is no display. In both cases, there is the feeling that I do not need this. But in one case, it is the silence of a person who stands on their own feet. And in the other, it is the silence of a person who simply does not dare to come out of hiding. And the difference between them is not whether you post something or not. The difference is in what happens inside you when you think about the possibility of being seen. Does calm appear there? Or does tension, anxiety, and the desire to close the door appear? There is another unpleasant side to this avoidance. Over time, it begins to look like character. As if you really are that kind of person. Quiet. Invisible. Not about that. And the longer you live like this, the harder it becomes to admit to yourself that this was not the choice of strength, but the choice of protection. Because to admit that means to admit that for years you could have lived a little more bravely, a little more honestly, and you did not. And that is a very heavy admission. Sometimes, I do not post is not the choice of the strong. It is the alibi of the weak. It is a way not to test yourself against reality, not to face possible disappointment, not to take risks. But, and this is important, this is not an accusation. This is not a verdict. This is simply an honest point from which another conversation can begin. Because living is always a risk. It is always a possibility of being seen. Not necessarily on the internet. Simply in the world. In relationships. In choices. In attempts. And here the most important question of this part arises. Do you really stay off the stage because you do not need it? Or because you are afraid to find out what will happen if you step onto it? And this causes a strange reaction. A mixture of confusion, light suspicion, and quiet judgment. Because we live in an era where being seen has become almost a synonym for being real. We have lived in this system for so long that we have begun to confuse life with its reflection, to confuse experience with its version, to confuse ourselves with an image. And gradually, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new strange form of splitting appears. You live, and at the same time you observe how you live. You experience, and at the same time you think about how it will look. You feel, and somewhere nearby there is already a thought about how this can be shown or preserved. Life begins to be lived not only in order to be lived, but also in order to be recorded. And here it is worth asking a very simple, but very uncomfortable question. At what moment did we agree to this? At what moment did it stop being enough for us to simply be? At what moment did experience stop being self-sufficient and start needing confirmation? At what moment did we begin to live as if, without a spectator, none of this quite counts? You can say that this is just technology, that these are just tools, that we decide ourselves how to use them. And formally, that is true. But any environment in which you live slowly and imperceptibly changes how you think, what you consider normal, what you begin to expect from yourself and from life. If you live for a long time in a world where everything is measured, you begin to measure. If you live for a long time in a world where everything is shown, you begin to show. And if you live for a long time in a world where being seen means being significant, you very slowly begin to confuse value with visibility. And then a person who posts nothing looks not just like a person with a different choice. They look like a person who is somehow breaking an unspoken agreement. Because the unspoken agreement sounds like this: we all show each other that we are living. And if you do not show it, then something is wrong with you. But if you stop and look more closely, often everything is not so simple. Often, behind this silence, there is not emptiness. Often, there is a choice. There are people who do not want to turn their life into a shop window. Not because they have nothing to show, but because the very idea of showing seems strange to them. There is something deeply intimate about living moments without immediately translating them into a format of proof. Drinking coffee without photographing it. Laughing without turning on the camera. Walking down a beautiful street and not feeling this inner need to confirm that you were there. There is a special kind of wholeness in being inside the moment and not standing next to it in the role of the operator of your own life. Social media has quietly taught us a very strange idea, as if life should not only be lived, but also documented. As if without this it is incomplete. As if you experienced something but did not show it, you did not experience it fully. And at some point many people begin to live not quite in their life, but in its version, in how it looks, in how it reads, in how it will be perceived. A person who posts nothing often simply remains entirely inside their own life. But here, almost imperceptibly, we come to the most unpleasant thought. What if not every silence is freedom? What if sometimes it is not depth, not awareness, and not maturity? What if sometimes it is fear? Fear of being seen, fear of judgment, fear that if you show yourself, it will turn out that there is not much to show. And from this point on, a completely different conversation begins. From the place where we stopped, a conversation begins that you want to turn away from, because it is no longer about the era, not about society, and not about culture. It is about you, about the place inside where you decide whether to show yourself or not, to step out or to stay in the shadows, to take a risk or to pretend that you simply do not care. What if your silence is not depth? What if it is fear? Fear of being seen, fear of being judged, fear that if you show yourself, it will turn out that there is not much to show. Fear that in the moment you step into the light, it will become clear that you are ordinary, not outstanding, not special, not the person you would like to be. We rarely admit this fear to ourselves. It is much easier to call it awareness, modesty, boundaries, not wanting to live on display. And sometimes that is true, but sometimes it is simply a very beautiful way not to come close to the edge. Because being seen is always a risk. It means allowing the world to say, "You matter," or you are not needed. It means facing not only possible approval, but also indifference. And indifference is much more frightening than criticism. Criticism at least says, you were noticed. Indifference says, you do not exist. And here, inside almost every person, lives a very ancient fear, the fear of being insignificant. We live in a culture that promises everyone that they are special, that they are unique, that they must unlock their potential, that their life should be something more than just a quiet human existence. And against the background of these promises, being simply normal begins to feel almost like a failure. And then silence becomes a refuge. If you do not step onto the stage, you cannot be booed. If you do not show yourself, you cannot be ignored. If you do not try, you do not formally fail. And inside, this can look very noble. I do not need attention. I am not interested in this game. I am above this. But the honest question sounds different. Are you above it? Or are you afraid? There is a strange asymmetry. We notice other people as courage very easily and justify our own avoidance very beautifully. We say, I am just like this. But sometimes, I am just like this is a sentence that we sign for ourselves in order not to test who we could be. Think honestly. How many things in your life are there that you do not because you do not want to, but because you are afraid that it will not work out? Afraid that nobody will notice. Afraid that they will notice and be disappointed. Afraid that you will have to face the fact that you are not who you wanted to think you were. And here another, even more unpleasant thought appears. Sometimes we choose not to live, but not to risk living. We confuse calm with the absence of movement. We confuse safety with the absence of attempts. We confuse "this does not matter to me" with "I am afraid." And this is a very thin line, because from the inside it really can seem that you simply do not want to, that you do not need it, that you are fine as it is. But there is a simple test, very simple and very cruel. If you imagine that nobody will ever know about what you do, nobody will see it, nobody will judge it, nobody will praise it, nobody will condemn it, would you still do it? If the answer is yes, then perhaps it really is yours. If the answer is no, then it is worth honestly asking yourself, why? We often think that dependence on other people's gaze is about those who constantly post something, but that is not quite so. Very often the most dependent are those who show nothing, but constantly imagine how it could look. Those who live not in reality, but in an imaginary court, because you can stay off the stage and still live in front of the audience. An imaginary spectator appears in your head, an imaginary public, an imaginary judge, and you begin to live your life not for yourself, but in front of this gaze, either justifying yourself or refusing in advance, or explaining in advance why you are not like that. And here we come to, perhaps, the most insidious thing. From the inside, real freedom and careful avoidance feel almost the same. There is one strange and almost invisible trap that even those who are sure that they are outside this whole system fall into. Even those who hardly post anything. Even those who consciously keep their distance from the display window. The trap is very simple. You can stay off the stage and still live for the audience. Because the stage has long since moved inside. An imaginary spectator appears in your head. An imaginary observer. The one in front of whom you either justify yourself, or explain yourself, or stay silent, but still keep them in mind. You may not show your life, but you still know how it could look. You still know which frames would be considered worthy. Somewhere inside, you still hold this invisible gaze. And as long as this gaze is there, you are not quite free. Even if your profile is empty. Because real unfreedom does not begin with the post button. It begins when you live as if someone is watching you, even when nobody is watching. There is a very simple and very honest question that almost nobody asks themselves. Who are you when nobody is watching you? Not on the internet, not at work, not in the family, not in a role, but completely alone, without witnesses, without judgment, without a story that can be told. What do you do then? How do you live? And do you live at all? We have become so used to existing in reflections, in reactions, in expectations, in images, that sometimes we lose contact with that quiet point inside where you simply are. And perhaps that is why silence is so frightening. Because in silence there is nobody left to play a role for. Nobody to prove anything to. Nobody to explain why you are the way you are. Only you remain there. And that is, perhaps, the most honest and the most frightening conversation you can have with yourself. There are people who treat their privacy very carefully. not out of fear, but out of respect. They intuitively feel that not everything should be turned into a story, that some experiences become poorer when they are turned into words too early, that some moments lose their depth when they are immediately brought into the light. The internet does not forget, but it almost never remembers context. It keeps forms, but it does not keep meaning. And when you give a piece of your life to it, it stops being yours in the former sense. It becomes part of the general noise. For some, refusing to participate in this is not an escape, but a form of sovereignty. A way to say, my life is not a product. My inner world is not content. My relationships are not material for a display window. But even here it is important to be honest with yourself. Is this sovereignty, or is it still a shelter? And the answer to this question is not in whether you have accounts, and not in how many posts you have. It is in what happens inside when you think about the possibility of being seen. If inside there is calm, indifference, freedom, then perhaps you really do not need the stage. If inside there is tension, anxiety, tightness, and the desire to hide, then perhaps the stage is still controlling you. You are just standing behind the curtains. There is one more subtle thing. When you stop living for display, your attention is freed. You begin to think less about how it looks and more about what it means. You fix less and live more. You collect less proof and collect more experience. While some are trying to catch the perfect shot of the sunset, others are simply looking at the sunset. This does not make them better, but it makes them more present. Because life is not something that can be fully preserved. It always slips away. And perhaps that is exactly where its value lies. There is a very simple criterion that distinguishes a life lived from the inside from a life lived for the gaze. If you imagine that nobody will ever know what you did, nobody will see it, nobody will judge it, nobody will remember it, would you still do it? If yes, perhaps that is your life. If no, perhaps that is your stage. And then the question no longer sounds like this. Why do you not post? But like this. For whom are you living at all? Because you can be very active on social media and live not your own life. And you can be almost invisible and still live for an imaginary spectator. Real freedom does not begin when you delete the apps, and not when you stop posting. It begins when you no longer need your life to be confirmed. When you can be imperfect, unremarkable, unphotogenic, and at the same time real. And perhaps it is exactly there, where the need to prove ends, that life begins. Not the kind that can be shown, and not the kind that can be hidden, but the kind that can simply be lived.